Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, and you're very welcome to another Signpost webinar. Today we'll be discussing climate adaptation in forestry. Forests play an important role in delivering ecosystem services from carbon capture and storage to enhancing biodiversity at a wider landscape level. But what are we doing to protect our forests against the impact of climate change? And we're delighted here today to be joined by Dr. Niall Farrelly, Senior Forestry Research Officer in Teagasc. Niall, good morning. How are you keeping?
I'm very well, altogether, yeah. Delighted to be here this morning.
And we're also joined by John Casey, who's going to assist us with the questions later. Good morning, John.
Morning, Cathal. How are you?
And Niall, before we get into your presentation, maybe you might tell us a little bit about the work that you do in general.
Yeah, I work on Forestry Research Program here in Teagasc. I look at the genetics, so it's basically from seed to sawdust, Cathal. Looks at, the choice of seed and the choice of varieties we use, provenances, how they're adapted to the climate and the soils in Ireland, how we manage those for a variety of ecosystem services, and, how we can plan for the future, how those trees, the adaptation mechanisms they have in them. So, also the timber quality as well, so it's a whole wide range of research we conduct here in Teagasc, along with colleagues.
Yeah, when you mention seed to sawdust, and we're always talking about climate change and the impacts and everything that's going on, you kind of forget that the forestry and trees have their own challenges as well.
Indeed, and look, they're remarkable organisms, really. They're long-lived organisms, 500 years. We've got some examples in California which are living from 4,000 years, and they contain remarkable information about how those trees have adapted to the past. You look at any tree rings, for example, and they'll tell you the success in trees. So they're robust organisms. Sometimes they need a little bit of assistance, and I'm delighted to be here this morning to talk about that, actually.
Yeah, they've seen a lot of history passing by, that's for sure, at that kind of age. I think that's good, Niall. So whenever you're ready, you can kick off.
That's great, Cathal. Yeah, my talk here today is about climate adaptation in forestry. And I'm going to bring you some of my experiences, actually, from working in forestry research and dealing with a whole host of trees. And what we can do, there's strategies we can do. First, talk about what are the climate parameters we need to be interested in from a forestry perspective and an agricultural perspective as well. How these are affecting the growth of trees, and also what are the mechanisms we have to be able to adjust or adapt by selecting material and adjusting our strategies to enable our forests to be more climate resilient as such. So look, I'll start the presentation. I think everybody's familiar with the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere increasing. The effect of that is creating a temperature rise across the globe. This is happening at the moment, and a series of representative concentration pathways have been developed by the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These concentration pathways are a group of scenarios, effectively, that describe how the climate will change with different concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So they're quite useful. I'm going to use them in the presentation here to describe how the climate's going to change and give people an indication of different scenarios and what's the likelihood of how trees will adapt in these scenarios. So the representative concentration pathways, there's a number of them, and you can see on the graph there. They're associated with increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, creating a forcing effect or a greenhouse gas effect. Many people will be familiar with this already, so it's just really a recap. So there are a variety of RCPs. I think there's actually now 6 of them. There's one which is based on the Paris Agreement, which is a little bit lower. I think it's RCP 1.6. And you can see in the graph there to the right-hand side, temperatures predicted to rise in RCP, so from RCP 2.6 to RCP 8.5, there's an increase in temperature. And this is associated with the RCP having more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Along with the increase in temperature, there's a predicted sea level rise. And again, associated with all of this is increased uncertainty, extreme weather conditions associated with the increase as we go from the lower RCP to the higher RCP. So I suppose a degree of uncertainty here. These are useful in order to get an idea of what the levels of carbon dioxide concentrations will have on the weather. So it's just an illustrative example as such. Okay, these RCPs are useful in terms of climate change models. These are a series of climate change models which represent a change in temperature. And of course, the temperature is predicted to rise. The more severe RCPs, the temperature will rise more, and the less severe the temperature will rise less. So, for example, I've highlighted two particular scenarios there. RCP 2.6 is where you've got a certain level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that will lead to an increase of about 1 degree in the temperature by 2021 to 2050. And then the most severe circumstance where you lead to an increase in temperature of 3 degrees. Similar to temperature, we can expect a temperature rise across all seasons, actually. Similar to temperature, precipitation will be affected by climate change. And this has an effect for forestry, of course, in terms of drought and in terms of increased waterlogging. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on. The increase mainly is in the winter rainfall and the distribution of rain events. So, for example, we'll see a decrease in summer rainfall in the eastern part of the country in general, somewhere in the region of 5 to 10% in the short term, and then an increase in winter rainfall, especially in the west. As somebody who lives here in Galway is familiar with getting increasing rainfall. I can expect a bit more in the coming years, I suspect, with these scenarios. In terms of the growing season length, in Ireland, we have a fairly good growing season ranging from 220 days to 340 days on the left-hand side there. We can expect, that increase in temperature is going to lead to a change to the growing season. And, to be a percentage change with RCP 4.5 from 12 to 46% is predicted. And then as we go to the more extreme RCP concentrations of carbon dioxide, we can expect a longer growing season between 17 to 55%. As I explained earlier on, these are hypothetical climate change scenarios, so giving you a kind of an extreme version of it. Similarly to the change in temperatures above 10 degrees. So, this is interesting from the perspective of growing crops which we may have never grown in Ireland before, becoming more suitable to climate, but also to the prevalence of pests and diseases, those pests and diseases that are more at home in warmer temperatures. And we might discuss that in a bit more detail in terms of forest pests later on. So we can see a percentage change in the warmer temperatures above 10 degrees, somewhere in the region of 37 to 74% for the mid RCP, and larger for the highest RCP. Again, what is the result of this change? Really, what we're looking at is a decrease in summer precipitation. As I said earlier on, we're dealing with a higher frequency of dry periods in the country, and changing depending on the climate projection or climate change scenario, and particularly changing across the country. I'll explain how we actually picked up some effects of this already in a study we've been doing using a dendrochronology study, which looks at tree rings. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And also, conversely, we're getting more variability in the rainfall with these projection models, which will result in more wet days. So rather than getting the rain distributed, the rain will be occurring in more event-driven phases. So, more extreme events, rainfalls occurring, creating an issue in terms of a greater number of wet days. Those are particularly relevant to forestry, and I'm actually dwelling on those for a particular reason I'm going to explain now in the next couple of slides. Again, the dry periods, what we can expect from forestry, well, I think we've seen across the globe in California, France, Italy, etc., across Europe, as an increase in fire events. And the fire events, basically the forests are drying out, the foliage is drying out, they have a lot of fuel in them from dead and dying trees, which creates the risk of fire increasing. And we've seen that across for the last couple of years during the summers. Extreme temperatures, actually, and extreme temperatures in areas which have never seen them. Oregon got a 40-degree maximum temperature, which has never seen it, where a lot of the fires are in the US. We've seen the results of disturbances to forests as a result of increased winds, and we had a storm event, Storm Darwin, in 2014, which caused a lot of damage to Irish forests. It was a hurricane, and before the hurricane, we had an extreme period of rainfall, actually about a month of rain, which was unsettling conditions, which, as if you like, created instability in the soils. And then we had the tail end of a hurricane, Darwin, in 2014, which caused a lot of damage. So we're familiar with the storm damage in Ireland. It's quite familiar to us, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more as well. In terms of using the information we have in Teagasc and combined effects, how can we then use those tools to basically highlight areas which may be vulnerable, in the next 20, 30 years or whatever, and that allows us to identify the scale of potential problems in the future and how we can plan for those. So I've just illustrated, talking about the last slide, wind blow. We're going to see an increase in water saturation in soils, and that'll become an issue for soils which are already poorly drained. And again, strategies to increase the stability of forests in these areas would be a wise decision, to look at. Can we increase the stability of trees? Do we need to treat the forests different, etc.? So this graph here shows areas which are poorly drained and would be subjected to uncertain storm events. But again, these are just model predictions. You could look at the areas that are in white there on the map, being the areas which are poorly drained soils in Ireland. So look, we can use two factors to make a determination here, a basic determination, and then get an idea of the likely scale of issue. I think foresters are quite familiar with the scale of wind blow as forests are approaching maturity anyhow, so they'll be familiar with this. I talked about the drying climate, and the drying climate, generally we would have probably a drought event in forests, because forests are going for 30, 50, 80 or 120 years. One particular drought event doesn't really make that much difference because the trees are quite resilient. They'll bounce back again the following year after being droughted. So what really happens to the trees once they're in a drought event? The trees actually stop growing. Their stomata closes on the leaves. In broadleaves, the leaves drop off and they just sit there. In conifers, the stomata close and they just basically shut down for a period of time, and they wait for the conditions to reoccur to be conducive to growth again. The water is replaced in the system. We looked at a study here, a dendrochronology study, and we found in 2018, the very warm summer that we had. People might remember it. I remember driving up the motorway from Galway to Dublin and seeing all the trees dropping their leaves. So it was quite intense. We discovered the effect in 2018 when we started looking at the rings of the trees. And the graph here that shows a decrease in yield effectively associated. And again, we see a bounce back ability of the trees. I talked about trees being remarkably resilient organisms. So the following year, when the water is replaced, they will bounce back again. I'll talk a bit more about, when trees are under stress, they may be more subjected to damaging agents. Talk about that in a bit more detail as we go on through the presentation. Again, the use of mapped resources we have in our Teagasc are very useful. And again, these are three maps. They show the annual rainfall here, and I've highlighted the areas where the annual rainfall is quite low. Not low enough, minded, to stop the growth of trees. This is under 1200 millimeters and under 800, etc. And then I look at the available water capacity in the soils, and then I combine them to create a combined map which highlights the areas which in the future may be subjected to lower water during the growing season, and also that I have soils which don't have a lot of water holding capacity. So these are strategies we can identify areas where maybe we need to examine what's happening in here to the trees. How are the forests growing? Are they under stress? And if so, do we need to have a look at that when we get an opportunity to change the system, maybe change the species? I'll talk a bit more about, how we can make those decisions. I talked about the rise in temperatures and how that will affect the growing season, but also the rise in temperatures will have an effect on the fecundity of damaging agents, pests, and diseases. And of course, as trees are under stress due to drought, we've seen it across Europe, and they become more vulnerable to then damaging agents such as a bark beetle or aphids or whatever, and they become more stressed. Whether they have the ability to recover from that is uncertain, or whether they can bounce back again after that. Certainly in the case of aphids, again, a warm winter will be conducive to more aphids being available in the spring, and the aphids generally tend to attack the old foliage. So the tree has the opportunity to respond the following year when it grows and puts on new foliage. And it's really a cyclical event with aphids. And a lot of these pests are cyclical events, although the prevalence of the bark beetle in Europe is on the rise as a result of the drying of the forests, and the forests are already under stress. So I might talk about that a bit more, how we can look at that. Is there any strategies we can use our forests to adapt? Again, in the disease, the larch dieback, which is called by Phytophthora amorum disease, which was first evidenced in here, I think in about the early 2000s, and the damage that's caused, you can see here on the left-hand side. So basically, the Pyromortem disease was originally a disease which mutated and came in from California, from sudden oak death, it was originally called, mutated, and then it was very prevalent on Japanese larch. The other species of larch seem to be less affected by it. Strategies in terms of finding trees to replace these large trees, can be done through an analytical approach. And we published a paper there along with my colleague Richard Walsh and Andrew Cameron, which looked at, what's the potential to replace these diseased trees with, again, productive trees or trees which will grow quite well. So look, there's strategies for replacing the damaged trees or the dead trees with other trees, and an analytical approach can work quite well. Other approaches to assessing risk can be, and this is an example of a threat risk matrix. So you identify the species you're interested in, you identify the risks. And this is only a two-factor drought tolerance matrix, a biotic risk matrix. And again, it follows a traffic light system approach, where you can have a red, an amber, and a green pathway. And those pathways might indicate that this is something we should look at, or this is something where, horizon scanning is useful. You can put horizon scanning in here, where you can go longer periods into the future. You can look at, what's likely to come in, identify pests and diseases that may be currently in another country, and add them into the matrix as well and create it. It's used here as an example of how a forester might assess, if he's planting trees, how he might assess the risk. And I think as we go through and we adapt our climate to these risks and to the increasing temperatures, iterations like this can be very, very useful in terms of how we choose the species we're going to deploy into forests in the future. What are the effects of all of these temperatures on forests? What are the actual effects that's happening? And, we talk about a rise in temperature, rise in spring and autumn temperatures. And we're already seeing an earlier start to the growing season. The buds of trees are starting to flush early. We hear from phenological gardens across Europe and also in Ireland as well about an earlier flushing across all species of shrubs and trees. So look, we're seeing that already, and we're going to get, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. Again, you know, drought effects, lower summer precipitation. I talked about fire already. The preponderance of extreme events. We had our extreme event in forestry in Storm Darwin in 2014, and we had a recent wind event as well. I'm not sure what damage was caused to trees. I didn't get any feedback of that, but you know, we were getting these uncertain, more extreme events, and they're forecasted to increase in frequency. Again, the vegetation is becoming drier, especially in the spring is a time for forest fires, and the vegetation is not yet greened up, it's quite brown in the forest, and then, you know, the forest fires can be started as a result of that. I want to talk about strategies in terms of species selection and also the genetic variation in species and why that's useful. And, you know, the more species we have in Ireland, it means we have more insurance species if something happens. If the temperature's changing, the climate's changing, it just gives us more diversity, and genetic diversity is an important element of that as well. You know, we need to assess the suitability of these species, and how we've done that in the past is we've assessed species suitability trials and provenance performance in trials and demonstration plots across Ireland to see what's doing quite well. We want to see how our native trees are doing. We want to examine those, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail as well. Genetic variation, we hear a lot of it. It's very important. Again, if you have a large genetic pool or genetic variation in your population of trees, it's potentially that's associated with a wide amplitude for growing in diverse conditions. And again, we see that in a wide level of species distributions. For oak, for example, oak covers a wide distribution across Ireland and Europe, and that has large genetic diversity. So, you know, is there an element where we can use that diversity in terms of adapting our trees? I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And again, species with a small gene pool are vulnerable to climate change, so they don't have the mechanisms or the traits to be able to adapt. That's in a general statement. So conservation would be very important to preserve those species and understand them as well. I talk about how we could potentially choose species or look at replacements, for example, that are damaged. And one of the simplest things we've done is just a climate matching. And the way the climate matching works is you look at the climates where you've got tree species growing across in similar climates to Ireland. So we look at Ireland and the UK, we're growing in a temperate oceanic range at the moment, and we're similar to these areas across the globe. So technically then those trees coming from those areas might prosper in an Irish environment, or we might have gene pools in those environments which might be expected to prosper for our native species, etc. If we look at a warmer variant of our own climate, we see these warmer variants, the Iberian Peninsula, areas of Chile, and areas of the US. So these are warmer variants. So there may be opportunities there to that species coming from these areas may be more likely to reinforce what we have already to make us more resilient, and these species will already be adapted. I talk about opportunities as well. We've an increased growing season in Ireland, which is going to be predicted, and you know, species. This is just purely an example. We reckon that 13 species, some examples there, are doing quite well in Ireland. We have the potential for other species to do well under climate change scenarios. These species would not exactly be well adapted to Ireland, but as the climate becomes warmer, and it's an illustrative example of how we can move material that's already adapted to climates into our climate to prepare ourselves and reinforce our growing stock. Again, to have examples of these species growing in an Irish context already is invaluable. And these are some plots in JFK, John F. Kennedy Park down in Wexford in the Arboretum. And examples of red oak, for example, hickory, southern beech, western red cedar, wingnut, etc. These are doing reasonably well, and we have examples of them. So they're showing levels of adaptation. So that's very useful for a forester to have the confidence that these tree species are already doing well in Ireland, and also in other plots of other species as well in the John F. Kennedy Park, which are an invaluable time capsule. Some of the strategies being used internationally are to move seed sources from a southern region into a northern region. This is happening quite actively with oak in France, where they're selecting their seed to come from southern regions because it's already adapted to the climate that they hope to be in, or they will be in, shall we say, according to the projections within the next 30 or 40 years. And you must remember, oak is a longleaf species. It's 120 years, 200 years in France. So, for example, to reinforce it by taking seed from further south is a sensible option, actually, and to see how that is developing in the area. Similarly, oak coming from different regions of Europe could be used as a potential for reinforcing. What should we be concerned about in terms of the climate and trees? Well, of course, we want to maintain our vigor in trees and the production element. Also, the extended growing season may present opportunities. And if we don't have the material to take advantage of that, well, then the material that we have won't be able to take advantage of that. Things that are relevant are bud bursts. I talked about earlier on about bud bursts occurring earlier, and that might be a double-edged sword because it may make trees more vulnerable to an uncertain frost event. We see in the graph there produced by Katrina Duffy and Maynooth, there about an increase of 20 days associated with bud burst. So an earlier bud burst by 20 days across all species. Norway spruce, oak, I think beech as well. I talked about hardiness. Hardiness is an adaptation mechanism, which basically we don't want to be putting material out into forest, which is not going to survive the exposure or the wind and the rain. So look, it has to be somewhat hardy. It's something we have to take on board. What is the water use efficiency, pest and disease risks? I talked about conservation and species that are maybe somewhat threatened, and think about conservation strategies for these species. It's very important. Part of our culture, and we should be looking at conserving these and then the biodiversity aspects in terms of the planting the tree species. Are we losing biodiversity? Are we gaining it? Has to be considerations. I talked about the pest risk increasing, and one of the bits of research I've been involved in was assessing the increase in tolerance to pests. This was assessing Sitka spruce tolerance to pine weevil, and screening Sitka spruce provenances for its tolerance to pine weevil in a site in County Clare. So these are all useful screening tests that we can use. An example of how we could screen the material that we bring in from different pests and diseases. Now that's an indigenous pest, and it's on the rise actually. Its fecundity rate is increasing, its generational rate is increasing due to the warmer summer. So I think there used to be 2 generations during the growing season, now we're talking about 3. So there's an increasing incidence of these pests and diseases, and it's about preparation, how we prepare our material and what are the threats and risks we perceive. Is that material robust? Drought tolerance is another thing, and we've been looking at drought tolerance. We've been looking at it for the last couple of years, setting up trials, looking at the differences in Sitka spruce provenances and their ability to withstand reduced watering, for example. And again, some southern provenances are performing quite well. The results are not quite available at the moment. We again can look at coring of trees, and this is a technique where you core the trees and you look at how the trees have actually responded to historical climate trends, and you can get an idea amongst different provenances, different types of trees, how they will likely respond in the future. And you can see they're You can trace the rings back. We have technology in here to trace the rings back to the actual drought event and how they recover the following year. I talked about genetic diversity. Excuse me. Genetic diversity is very important. This is a genetic diversity study which carried out by Thomas Byrne and published in the journal Forest. Looks at genetic diversity in Sitka spruce. And when you examine it, you extract the DNA and you look at the genetic sequences of this data, it does indicate that there's unique populations of this which may be useful. And again, this is across all species. You know, if we understand the genetics, we kind of get an idea how they've evolved in the past. So you can see with Sitka spruce, we see 4 particular blocks there on the map, and they've evolved in their own unique circumstances. The northern group there in Alaska has evolved in a kind of a glacial habitat or ecosystem. The southern group is evolved in a warmer conditions, and the island group is more inbred, for example, because it doesn't get the chance to receive pollen from the mainland. So look, these are very interesting techniques. Genetic diversity, of course, is associated with the ability for trees to adapt in different climates in general. Talk about oak as well. Oak is this is work carried out by Colin Kelleher in National Botanic Gardens. We have quite a lot of genetic diversity in oak in Ireland, which is great news. We see there's as much genetic diversity in oak as we see across Europe, and that will show you for the 2 species of Quercus petraea and Quercus robur. So that's good news. We have the stock here in Ireland. Exactly. So look, it's about conservation and it's about maintaining that at this stage. So it's good to understand how the material, is it a genetic narrow pipeline or is it more diverse? And we understand it's now a bit more diverse than we previously thought. I talked about the challenges and opportunities. There are opportunities, there's challenges, but again, the key message here is plan, prepare, and adapt for the future. And again, it's all about growing forests for 30, 50, 120 years or so forth for future generations, and how are they maintained to be resilient. I'm going to just finish here now on the last slides of how we can possibly bring all this information together and increase the resilience of our forests. We can plan, prepare, and adapt by using climate-smart adaptation strategies. And again, we want to ensure that the material we're using is resilient. We understand it, its adaptability. What is the role of improved material? Is improved material working better because it's been growing in an Irish environment? Just a little understanding of what we're using, what the conditions it can tolerate. What are the implications of your decisions? If you establish a forest, well, what are the implications? Is the system sustainable? Is it going to be sustainable for the 30 years that you wanted, or the 50 years, 120 years, or whatever? Is the management system sustainable? So look, really to finish here, I've got one more slide after this, is consider the options and the actions you're taking, and are they robust across a range of potential future conditions, such as the RCPs, a low change to the climate, and mid change, etc. And these are all considerations. I just want to talk about how we can take strategies. The 3 strategies that we've chosen to look at here in Teagasc Research, along with our partners here, who are listed down below, are to be look at creating resilience by understanding the forest genetic material, or the tree species and provenance and varieties that we're deploying to the forest. Understand what it's able to withstand. How can it adapt? Also, what are the management strategies that will increase that resource that's already existing out there to continue to be sustainable and sequester carbon, but be adaptive to change as well? So that's a very important thing. What is the management strategy we're using? And also the key thing is the protection strategies. Can we look at protection strategies? Is there mechanisms where we can do increased monitoring and surveillance that will identify biotic and abiotic threats as they occur, and we have solutions for them in advance? I think it's a good strategy. It's a combined strategy. I want to give acknowledgement to the funders here of a lot of this research that I'm conducting myself and my team, and my partners here who are listed down below. And Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine, who's given great support to the research we're conducting here in the group. And without that support, this work wouldn't be possible. So look, it's really welcome. It's visionary in a way, and we hope to make a lot of progress in this. So two of the projects that I draw your attention to on the Teagasc website are the Fit Forest project and the Adapt Forest project. And we're working together with our partners, our research partners here, to try and develop solutions which can be practically implemented in the forest and in the field. Okay, so I hope I wasn't too long in delivering that presentation, and I think I'm available for some questions.
Niall, that was a super presentation, hugely informative. I've learned a lot. I'm concerned with some of the stuff you've come up with there that are challenges. It's obviously not as simple as stick a tree in the ground and let it grow to the end. So there's loads of really good questions coming in, and John is going to address those now shortly. And just remind everyone to keep throwing questions into the Q&A tab. But Niall, the one thing that really, I suppose, from a non-forestry person like me, that really my ears pricked up when I heard you talking about dieback, because we're all used to ash dieback, and you mentioned larch dieback as well. Are we concerned that some of our species are going to, as climate change? You mentioned that we could even have up to 3-degree change. Are we concerned that something like dieback can come in and wipe out some of our native species or some of the commercial species that we really rely on in the next 20, 30, 40 years?
A very good question. I have, again, the simplest way to think about forest diseases is they're always there, you know, and we get new ones into the system due to commercial importation of material. So we have to be vigilant in terms of, and like the Department of Agriculture are currently, you know, monitoring. We have pheromone traps around the country as well. There are uncertainties with certain diseases being blown across the channel, etc. But when I studied forestry in UCD, which is not too long ago, but we always had a big emphasis on forest protection. The forest protection was a big emphasis in the course. So we were always familiar that the diseases are always prevalent in crops. You know what I mean? It's about the management, the strategy, the awareness, and raising awareness about them. And I spent some time in France in the French Forest Service, and we were very cognizant of disease in forests. And they were managed, the forests were managed with the diseases in situ. So, like, you know, it's part of the management process. And it's something we've been very fortunate in Irish context. Being an island nation, we've never really had diseases in forests to any great extent. But I suppose commercial trade, etc., has brought these diseases in here. So look, there's an element of management, preparation, protection, and management, which can be adapted here. I know on the ash dieback, it's a pretty fatal disease. It's quite a unique one in that regard. And again, it's something to be, we may have to prepare solutions and prepare them in advance. Be cognizant, again, preventative preparation, you know, would be useful in circumstances like this.
Are you as concerned about larch, the larch dieback? I hadn't really heard about that one before.
Yeah, larch dieback is something that's actually happened before. And larch would have been planted in a mixture, would have been a mixed species along with Sitka spruce and other conifers, and even with broadleaves actually. And again, larch, the issue with larch was that the disease came from a different tree species, and it was the first time it was found in the UK and Ireland on larch. Some of the species of larch are less affected, such as the European larch and the hybrid larch. We're currently doing some work on that with a colleague of mine, Laura Gillarden, who's looking at the level of infection in the other in the European and the hybrid larch to see if there's pathways there. Look, it's very unfortunate, but just indicates, you know, these things have arrived in the country, and you know, to be it's an unexpected situation really, how the disease. It's something to be cognizant of.
Yeah, John, that's really good questions coming through.
Yeah, actually, one of the questions was about European larch and why is it less affected by Phytophthora. I think maybe I would add, Niall was mentioning there about the research. There was a research project as well, Phytophthora project, and some of the things they showed there was that the European larch, it was better able to attack the Phytophthora rhoborum disease, the fungal disease, because it responded quicker than the Japanese larch. So it could produce more defensive compounds at an earlier stage than the Japanese larch, and therefore it had a greater chance of fighting off the disease. One of the questions there, Niall, is about continuous cover forestry in commercial continuous forest cover in commercial forests, and whether this would be one of the strategies that would be adopted to kind of mitigate risks. Could you comment on that? I think it's one.
Very interesting question, John. Yeah, I think continuous cover forestry is a management scheme that's very, very useful for growers if they want to maintain their continuous crop of trees. And you get the regeneration cycle. So again, there's benefits certainly to it in terms of, you don't have to protect against weevil, for example, or established or have very intrusive disturbance onto the site in terms of losing carbon. So the benefits of it are good. It can be improved possibly, or it can be augmented maybe by supplementary planting, because what seed is coming in then to regenerate it? Is it something that's vulnerable, or do you get a chance to diversify, which would be a great. So look, it's another management strategy that'll go to forming an overall strategy to diversification, I suppose, John. Reducing the risk.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I would say as well is that you have the Woodland Improvement Scheme. So there is a grant aid package there for continuous cover forestry over 3 interventions. And similarly, if you had, say, the Native Woodland Conservation Scheme as well for older woodland. So there are schemes and there are supports there. But it is time critical, I would say. You can't start continuous cover forestry too late.
The point I want to make there, John, and I think I mentioned it to you in a recent conversation we had, is that, get out there and walk into your forest, see what's going on, have a walk through it. If you notice anything, that's the citizen science, and we can be picking up on things. It's very, very useful. Plant the trees and come back 30 years later. It's good to have early warning, or even to see your trees are growing very well. So get out there, go for a walk in your forest. And the benefits of walking the forest are for your health are brilliant anyhow. So you'll learn a lot by going walking, and do it more actively. And that's what it's all about. It's all about getting out there, see what's going on. And if you notice something, you can talk to your Teagasc advisor about it, or you can talk to a specialist about it, or you can or whatever.
There's a comment here, or there's 2 questions actually came up here about the potential collapse of the Gulf Stream, and perhaps that it won't be warming but actually cooling that will happen. Do you have any comment on that? Or?
Well, I don't really, to be honest with you, John. I haven't got my scuba gear on in a while, so I don't have actually evidence of that. So look, all of these things are possibility, and I think one of the things I did mention in the presentation was uncertainty. You know what I mean? Like I don't have a crystal ball, but look, if the conditions get colder, warmer, windier, what can these trees do, or what can we do as foresters or managers to make sure that what we have now, we have a lot of tools in our tool belt to be able to adjust and adapt. We need to be more aware of what we have in our tool belt. So look, it's not all doom and gloom. We do have lots of opportunities there as well, but it's time to, because the rotations are so long in forestry, it's time to start thinking about them now and implement them. If you plant an oak tree today, it's going to be growing in the conditions of 120 years in the future.
One of the queries here then as well, Niall, was in terms of mitigating the risk of wind blow. What would be the recommendations in terms of reducing wind blow risk through management?
A very, very good question. There has been a lot of research done in Ireland in the past, such as drainage methods and mold drains, and the use of those and their effectiveness. Just a practical thing from my observations on the ground. Make sure all your drains are clear. That again, take a walk into the forest. You know, if you're seeing pools of water lying around, you know, you're going to create a situation where your forest is basically starting to develop a rocking sensation as such, and introduce blown trees into it. So look, have a walk through the forest, make sure all your drains, the forest are originally established. For forests we're establishing into the future, again, soil, the characteristics of the soil, how the trees will root in that soil, John, is very important. Are you going to manage them? What way are you going to manage them? Are you going to consider getting in there early and maybe making the trees more resilient, or are you going to decide in a very risky area to leave them untended? So there is a gamut of management solutions for windblow. However, I would say catastrophic events that we had in Storm Darwin, I just think in situations like those, there's probably little you can do in terms of just like this storm of the century as such. But it's not only trees that are going to be damaged in those situations, property will be damaged and everything else.
As part of the Fit Forest project, I suppose you're looking at different provinces, particularly for Sitka spruce, but other species. Is there a particular Sitka spruce province that you think you should be favouring now, as opposed to maybe Washington previously?
Very good question as well. What we're using, and we have a lot of trials actually looking at this across the country, and currently studying this. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. What we're using now seems to be very good, seems to be doing quite well. So, we have an improvement program for a variety of tree species, and that improvement program has been based on using indigenous, if you like, naturalized material, because it's been evidenced to be growing here, and that seems to be doing quite well. There is some information on oak, on native oak provenance trials, and that information will be coming out in the Fit Forest from AFBI actually, and from Future Trees, Forest Genetic Resources Trust are involved in that work as well. So look, it goes across all species to find, what have we been using? Is it still suitable? Or are there other options? I recently did a paper on Japanese red cedar, which is a really interesting species, and I found that we could actually change the provenance recommendation to a more southern one, and there was evidence in a provenance trial in Camolan in the County of Wexford, which suggested a southern one was actually performing much better in terms of its survival and growth. So look, to have these trials, to be able to have the techniques to analyze them is very, very valuable, and it's like reinforcing. It's the first key to reinforcing the trees we put out into the forests.
And one of the questions then, or one of the comments that came up was, are we getting caught up with the idea of just native trees being suitable in all conditions? Or if we're looking at climate change, is it possible that tree species that are not currently native may be more suitable?
I think native trees are very important. They're part of our heritage, and look, we're starting to understand a lot more about them. The work that was done in Rock Forest in County Clare with Scots Pine, and also the work which Colin Kelleher and his colleagues are doing in Botanic Gardens, is invaluable to understand the lineage and the genetic characteristics of that. Look, it's all reasonably, for oak, it's looking good in terms of genetic diversity. I would suggest that the native species are very important. We've had the ash dieback issue. We have issues with elm. The problem, of course, John, as you know, because of the ice age, we have a limit of natural vegetation in Ireland. And, as our 10 native species suddenly becomes vulnerable to disease, and it could happen to any tree species, this idea of diversification, diversification of trees. Like I'm a tree fan, regardless of what it is, oak or whatever. And I just love to see trees and the experience you get from walking through a forest. So look, diversification is probably a useful tool. How do we apply them? Do we apply the diversification at landscape level? That could be very useful. We haven't really explored that. So you basically design a forest at a landscape level to incorporate the features of the landscape. That could be quite useful.
Niall, I just looking at one of your slides here when you're talking about native trees, and I think at Scots Pine was down for moderate risk for biotic risk. What is the risk to Scots Pine?
Well, all pine species, Cathal, all pine species are subject to diseases, and all trees are subject to diseases in their native habitat. But pine in particular is subject to a needle blight, dotostroma. So, it basically causes discoloration of the needles. Hasn't been that prevalent in Ireland, or whether it's prevalent in Ireland at all, but it has been witnessed on the continent. And it's an idea, again, it's the humid climate causes this. So look, it's a moderate risk. It's a very important tree species, especially and its association with the red squirrel. There is a certain material, again, making awareness of, there may be material out there which may be less susceptible to disease. It might be a different provenance. So look, that's worthwhile investigating, I think.
As part of your threat risk matrix there now, there seems to be quite a correlation between species that are less tolerant of drought and then a higher risk, a higher biotic threat. In other words, if they're suffering drought conditions, they're more vulnerable to a biotic threat. Would you like to comment on the risk of, say, a spruce bark beetle in Ireland, and what we could do to mitigate or lessen, reduce that risk of it appearing?
Very good question, John. And, I don't know in terms of, look, I suppose we have a humid climate in Ireland, which is high humidity. That climate would be conducive for growing fungal or mycelia, etc. So, really, we have a great climate for growing that material. In terms of whether it's associated with different soil types, I don't really know. I don't have the evidence to suggest that. There is some evidence to suggest, and I mentioned this in the drought elements across Europe, that the drought conditions in Europe, in Norway spruce, for example, in Central Europe and Germany, exacerbated the effect. So you must remember, you're getting a warming condition of the environment, which is making it conducive to the breeding of the insect, and the tree is also under stress. So it's a double whammy, as I call it. You never get the single agent. It's got the double whammy effect. So you get the tree stressed. There is some information to suggest that as trees have less water, they're unable to produce the sap, which then can trap the beetle, etc. So look, I think that forests that are probably subjected to repeated drought, maybe the option is to start looking maybe at changing the species or provenances on those areas as the evidence produces itself.
If there's increasing pests, and I think you mentioned aphids and bark beetles and all the other stuff that comes with it, there's a comment or a question, I suppose, here. Can the role of hedgerows and maybe grass margins, natural predators, or even if the hedgerows were growing a bit taller, blockages for airborne disease, could they play a role in trying to reduce the impact?
I'm not sure. Look, from a biodiversity perspective, I think it's well established. Look, the hedgerows. I think the hedgerows, and especially the hedgerows we have in situ at the moment, make maybe an interesting reservoir for maybe tolerant material of native species. Because look, you've got to consider hedgerows are distributed throughout the country. So like if you have a hedgerow in Cork and you have one up in Donegal or whatever, like you've got that distribution of genetic material. There may be a chance that some of that may some way have evolved in a situation where it might be more tolerant to disease. So as a reservoir for material, I'm not sure about the spread of it. Again, if you look at Dutch elm disease, the beetle was well able to get its way around. And you must remember the beetle was attracted to mature trees and then injected its fungus into the tree, which stopped the water, and it was the dieback from the fungus which caused the death of the elm across Ireland. But there seems to be elm rejuvenating throughout hedgerows in Ireland, although it does seem to be when it gets to a mature stage, it does succumb. But again, look, that's the resilience again. I would say about the disease, I don't want to create the picture that it's we're going to be inundated with disease. Disease is a natural cycle in forests. We had it here after the Ice Age. We had collapse of tree species and then they rejuvenate it again. So I want to create the emphasis here on preparation and resilience. And like there are a lot of tools in the forester's tool belt, strategies, which can prepare us for these events, but it's about increasing the awareness in the general public and amongst growers and farmers and foresters themselves. So I think that's my function here today.
Yeah, I would say the other thing is the hedgerows themselves. Certainly, there's a very noted, it's a well-known fact that ladybird populations respond to the aphid numbers. So if you have a higher aphid number, then you will have an increased ladybird population that actually prey on the aphid. So, and similarly, if you have locations that these populations can overwinter, like hedgerows, well, of course, it would be a benefit. Yeah,
I think that information, John, is very useful. And then again, it probably you would have maybe heard that or seen it yourself and passed it on to forums like this. So look, this whole citizen science and people getting out there, is extremely useful.
One last question, maybe. There's a question here about a suitable alternative to ash. Do you have any comment on that now?
Yeah, that's a very interesting, and like we did the alternative to Japanese larch, and we did an analytical approach to it. Like, so we basically looked at all of the tree species that were growing in situ with ash, with larch that were growing quite well. So you can do the same for ash. Look, there is work going on in ash in Teagasc with colleagues in Oak Park, and they're looking at tolerance. So look, that work is still ongoing. There may be potential in that, but in the meantime, there are broadleaf species. And look, I did mention some of the species there earlier on. There may be birch native species which could fill the gap as well. And we do have some improvement programs in birch, for example. There's alder there as well. There are, maple, etc. Some people dislike or like different types of species, but like there are alternatives. Look at the ground which the ash is growing on and see is it suited for another species, or are there species growing nearby that are doing very well. That's a very good technique to use. Look down the road, what's growing in the hedgerow? Is it doing well? And is something going down the road doing well? And then would that grow well on my farm?
We're just, I suppose, coming to the end of the webinar now, so unfortunately we don't have time to answer any more questions. But Niall, it's a testament to your presentation that there's a load of questions in there. We didn't get to them all, and apologies to everybody for that. But I think we're going to have to revisit this in the future again because there's a huge amount of interest here. I'd just like to thank everybody for submitting the question. That's what makes the discussion so good. Niall, thanks a million for excellent presentation and your knowledge with us today. And I think people really appreciate it. And I certainly learned a lot and really enjoyed it. John, thanks a million for questions. A huge amount of knowledge, great contribution today as well. And just want to thank Yvonne Marr in the background. She is the driving force behind this webinar, and she keeps it all rolling along nice and smoothly. And next week, just before we wrap up for Christmas, we can look forward to a really interesting webinar. We're going to be chatting with Éanna Launa. She's a well-known author and broadcaster. We all know her. And we also have a special guest coming back to visit us, our former head of environment transfer program in Teagasc and host of the Signpost Series before I jumped into the seat with Mark. And that's Pat Murphy. He's coming back and he's going to talk with Éanna on the role of farmers in protecting nature. So that one is not to be missed. It'll be really enjoyable. So make sure to tune in again next Friday, 9:30, and slán go fóill.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost Series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost Series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.